This act of ritual sacrifice serves to remind us of our true disposition. What is that disposition? It's being a tiny speck on a tiny planet in a gigantic universe that's one among many universes. Ultimately, we control very little of our own fate, and to be reminded of that through ritual sacrifice is very valuable along the spiritual path. Welcome back to Diary of Devotion's weekly study on the Bhagavad Gita. Today we're going to be talking all about work, how to do work without becoming attached to the material results of that work. Throughout this chapter, Krishna has been giving us the sense that to act in the world is a necessary thing, but to do so without becoming entangled within attachments for the results of that work, that's a challenge. So Krishna is going to give us some interesting tips into how to actually accomplish this. Okay, he begins with text 9. It says, work done as a sacrifice for Vishnu has to be performed. Otherwise, work causes bondage in this material world. Therefore, O son of Kunti, perform your prescribed duties for his satisfaction, and in that way, you will always remain free from bondage. So we have at this point well understood that utilizing the bodily senses leads to contemplating sense objects, which then leads to attachment and bondage. However, Krishna reminds us that although such actions are unavoidable, simply offering those actions to the Lord as a sacrifice releases one from the binding effects of those actions. Now, this is a logical proposition. If one utilizes the senses as a means to selfish pleasure, then that action not only re-emphasizes the false sense of I and mine, it creates a strong mental habit that compels the mind to continually seek such self-centered pleasures. If, however, one's actions are done while thinking of the pleasure of the Lord, then the selfish desires that control so much of our lives are decentralized in favor of the Lord Himself. So next time you're standing in your kitchen preparing to cook a meal, let's say, instead of thinking about how delicious the meal will taste, try gently meditating on how much pleasure the Lord will get from tasting such things. Simply thinking of preparing a nice meal for the Lord is a form of sacrifice. We're sacrificing the tendency to reach out with our senses and anticipate our own enjoyment of these things, and we're offering that instead to the Lord. When we do that with sincerity and love for the Lord in mind, He certainly accepts it. Text 10. Krishna is going to put some context to this. He says, in the beginning of creation, the Lord of all creatures sent forth generations of men and demigods, along with sacrifices for Vishnu. This is exactly what he was just talking about. And blessed them by saying, be thou happy by this yajna, or sacrifice, because its performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and achieving liberation. Okay, but even if we have the best of intentions, our focus on serving the Lord may not always be steady. We may at first intend to think of His pleasure, but after some time, the mind will inevitably go back to its old habits and think of our own selfish desires. Such an occurrence is to be expected and will eventually be overcome with continual practice, with steadiness in this path. Vishwanath Chakravarti comments here that such a person who's unable to act with detachment should offer the fruits of his action to the Lord. In the case of preparing a meal, this means offering the finished product to the Lord as a ritual practice. So in other words, if we're unable to cook that meal with complete detachment to what will come of it, that's okay. That's a stage. That's a place that we need to go through in order to get to a higher place. The corrective for that is to simply acknowledge the place that we're at. Don't try to look past it. Don't try to jump past where we are. Acknowledge it and then take the fruits of that action, which is the finished meal itself, and offer that to the Lord. By continually doing this particular ritual practice, we will eventually come to the stage of detachment within the process of cooking that meal itself. That's just an example. This works for all kinds of actions. Okay, going back to the ritual of offering food to the Lord, for Vaishnavas, what this means is placing the foods near an image of the Lord, reciting certain mantras, and then leaving the preparations in that place for some time in order to allow the Lord to eat, so to speak. This can be kind of a complex ritual when done according to all the rules and regulations of the practice. But for those who have no image of the Lord, or who haven't been instructed in mantras for offering foods to the Lord, simply meditating on Him and mentally offering such things will sacrifice. The main point is to detach oneself little by little from the habit of simply grabbing and consuming that which attracts our senses, and instead attach ourselves to the habit of serving the Lord. It's important to remember that these rituals are not ends in themselves. The perfection of bhakti is not in memorizing mantras or perfectly executing a particular ritual. The perfection of bhakti is to constantly remember the Lord, to remember Him with fond feelings. So the rituals are there to aid us, but especially in the beginning, they're not necessary in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Simply the intent of placing something in front of Him with the intention of having Him enjoy that before we take it for ourselves, meditating on that is good enough. It's the purity of the intention rather than the precision of the action that holds the real importance. Okay, Krishna's going on in text 11. He says, "The demigods, being pleased by sacrifices, will also please you. And thus, by cooperation between men and demigods, prosperity will reign for all." Okay, but what are demigods? Are we talking about the Supreme Lord here, Krishna, the one God that we've been referring to this whole time? No, actually, demigods are understood to be very powerful beings who control natural phenomena like rain, sunshine, wind, etc., or who control various aspects of material life like the acquisition of wealth or power. However, they are not God. They are not the capital G God. They are ultimately beings who live and die just like humans do. And Narayan Maharaj explains that Krishna here, he doesn't intend for us to give up worshiping the Supreme Lord, the capital G God, in favor of worshiping these lesser gods. No, rather, because these demigods are dependent on the Lord for their existence, devotional service to Him, that is the ultimate, the one Supreme God, automatically achieves all the purposes of worshiping the demigods. Ramanuja concurs here, stating that the demigods actually act as limbs of the Lord, or surrogates with which He accomplishes certain purposes in the material world. It is the Lord who is the very self of the demigods, and who is the true recipient of all sacrifices. So what's Krishna saying here? He's trying to give us a sense that these demigods, these lesser gods, being limbs of Himself, will reciprocate with those people who worship Him ultimately. But the main point here is that we're not to see ourselves as the doers of action. If something comes to me by my own actions, let's say, if I go out and start a business and start making millions of dollars, it would be very easy for my false ego to grab onto that and say, I have accomplished this. Actually, the Lord is saying that the act of sacrifice is what accomplishes these things, and that sacrifice engenders reciprocation between us and the higher entities, the higher powers of the universe. So actually, we accomplish nothing on our own. Okay, let's hear a little bit more about these demigods. In text 12, Krishna says, "In charge of the various necessities of life, the demigods, being satisfied by the performance of yajna, or sacrifice, will supply all necessities to you. But he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods in return is certainly a thief." So Krishna here is revealing slightly more about the function of the demigods, stating that they're in charge of the various necessities of life, and by implication, the natural forces that provide these necessities. I mean, you can think of it like this. The rain falls on the earth, which gives sustenance to the crops. The crops grow, are harvested by human beings, are eventually eaten, and so on. And so it comes back to this practice of preparing a meal. What do you do for that? What do you do with that? Are we taking this gift that's been given to us by the demigods, ultimately by the Lord Himself, preparing that for our own enjoyment? Or are we looking at them as something that's being reciprocally given to us? Something that's being given in exchange, let's say, for which we can offer thanks. Krishna is saying here essentially that this is a divine gift. So what are we doing with this gift? Are we constantly focused on ourselves, on our own enjoyment? Or are we willing to take a portion of that and offer it back to the Lord as a sacrifice, as an offering of thanks? Krishna is saying that not going through these procedures of acknowledgement, that we are not the ones ultimately who are controlling our own fate and providing our own sustenance, is acting like a thief. To be grateful is the opposite of thievery. Tripurari Maharaj expands this idea further, stating that false proprietorship is the basic misconception that we suffer from in this world. We may think that we have sown the field, gathered the crops, and stored the grain. But how many of these actions would be possible if not for the rain provided by the sky itself? Entranced by thinking that we are the masters of our own fate, we enjoy our senses without regulation, thinking, I have accomplished great things, and to me should go the spoils. All this while hardly suspecting our own fragility and dependence. This act of ritual sacrifice serves to remind us of our true disposition. What is that disposition? It's being a tiny speck on a tiny planet in a gigantic universe that's one among many universes. Ultimately, we control very little of our own fate, and to be reminded of that through ritual sacrifice is very valuable along the spiritual path. Many times we think today that rituals are sort of needlessly performed, mechanically done, and so on, but actually the rituals, if done properly, are intended to remind us of these things constantly, to remind us of our smallness, of our dependence, and our connection ultimately to the Lord. But again, the ritual itself is not the perfection. The ritual itself is not the point. It's not necessarily needed to undertake complicated rituals. In the manner mentioned previously, we can simply set aside some time to offer foods to the Lord before consuming them and achieve a greater result than racking our brains trying to memorize all these mantras and so on. It's important to maintain focus. What are all these actions aiming us toward? Ultimately, they're intended to aim us toward pure love of God. Pure love of God means love of God without any material conditions attached to it. This is the idea that, okay, Lord, I'll love you so long as you take care of me. You provide for me my daily bread and so on. Then I'll love the Lord. Pure love of the Lord says, I will love you no matter what you do. Whether you provide for me, whether you take everything from me, that love for you will never be diminished. As long as the rituals are pointing us in the direction and bringing us further on the path of pure love of God, then they're worth doing. If they're not doing that, then some adjustment should be made. We might think of doing a ritual in a different kind of way, of tweaking things a little bit. With the guidance of an experienced devotee, this can bring us along the path of bhakti very, very quickly. The tendency can sometimes be to abandon rituals or to change them in ways that are unhelpful, but with an experienced guide, then we can navigate this much more easily. Okay, so what are our takeaways for today? We have to act in this world. We have to perform our duties. It's not going to be beneficial for most of us to run off to the forest or a cave somewhere and spend our time meditating on the Lord. Most of us are not ready for something like that, even when we think we might be. If we have any tinge of attachment to the material world, then we have to continue acting within this frame of reference. The key, however, is to find a way to do those actions while remembering the Lord, do them for the pleasure of the Lord, the service of the Lord, and so on. There's an infinite number of ways to do that. By associating with the devotees of the Lord, we can internalize some of these methods and utilize them to good effect on the path of bhakti. One thing that we can take from this is that anxiety is a result of expectation. I'm performing certain actions, I'm expecting a certain kind of result, and if I don't get that result, then I experience negative emotion. But if I act in the world as a sacrifice to the Lord, saying, I'm going to do these actions because it's my duty, and offer them to you, Lord, so that you can do whatever with them you wish. In other words, you can give them whatever result you like, and I will accept that. I don't have to worry about the outcome anymore. I know that's handled by someone else. What's required of me is to simply do the things that I am supposed to do in this world with the proper intent. Even if I fail to meet the expectations of that intent is something that still comes from within me. I get to control that piece. The other pieces will fall where they may. Once I work with that kind of attitude, then the anxiety of result-driven consciousness begins to dissipate. Also, don't discount the power of ritual. It's not simply some rote practice that's being done because of traditional reasons and has no meaning in our daily lives. Rituals can be very powerful practices that can serve to constantly remind us of the Lord, of our place in the universe, and that place which we want to go to. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for sticking around to the end. Be sure to join us next time where Krishna is going to describe what the results of acting in the ways that we've just described are for the practitioners. See you again next week. Jai Shri Radhe.